Check. Okay. Where did we leave off? Oh, stand by. December 29th meeting. It was the Clark letter previously. Okay, the next day, Rosen, Donahue, and Engel had a meeting with Mark Meadows, Pat Cipollone, and Cipollone's deputy, Pat Philbin, in the White House Chief of Staff's office. While the meeting dealt primarily with the presidential transition, the group discussed a draft civil complaint modeled after Texas versus Pennsylvania that the president wanted the Department of Justice to file challenging the results of the presidential election, tentatively called United States versus Pennsylvania. The DOJ officials said that they had not had time to thoroughly review the proposed suit, but initially indicated that it appeared to be flawed and did not seem viable for the DOJ to file. Meadows suggested that the DOJ leadership meet with William Olson and Kurt Olson, the two attorneys affiliated with the Trump campaign that had been working on the proposed suit, and added that Eastman and a retired judge from North Carolina named Mark Martin both had views about the lawsuit. In this meeting, Meadows also raised a new and outrageous allegation of election fraud, that an Italian company had been involved in changing votes in the presidential election. According to Meadows, there was a man whom Donahue later learned was in an Italian prison who claimed to have information supporting the allegation and that CIA officers stationed in Rome were either aware of the plot to interfere in the election or had participated in it. Donahue described how it was apparent that Meadows was not clear on the specifics of the allegation, but passed them along to DOJ to investigate nonetheless. Following the meeting, Donahue provided the information to the FBI, which quickly determined that the allegations were not credible. Meadows and other senior officials in the Trump administration, however, pressed DOJ to investigate every allegation of fraud, regardless of how absurd or specious. In the days after the December 29th meeting with Meadows, the senior DOJ officials more closely examined the proposed United States versus Pennsylvania lawsuit and determined that DOJ could not file it. Engel was principally tasked with examining the veracity of the suit and summarized his analysis in a series of talking points that he provided to Donahue on December 31st. Engel concluded that for multiple reasons, the proposed lawsuit lacked merit. First, the U.S. government did not have standing to challenge how a state administered its election. Such a challenge could only be brought by President Trump as a candidate and his campaign, or possibly an aggrieved Electoral College elector. Second, there was no identified precedent in the history of the Supreme Court establishing that such a lawsuit could be filed by the U.S. government. Third, by late December, states had already certified the results of their elections and the Electoral College had met, so suing states by this point would not impact the results of the election. Finally, unlike Texas versus Pennsylvania, which was one state suing another state, the lawsuit would not automatically be heard by the Supreme Court. This lawsuit wouldn't be heard by the Supreme Court automatically, so it should have been filed in a federal district court months prior, if at all, to have any possibility of impacting the outcome of the election. When asked about it during his interview with the Select Committee, Engel described U.S. versus Pennsylvania as a meritless lawsuit and said there was never a question about whether the department was going to file it. As senior DOJ officials had already explained to President Trump multiple times in November and December of 2020, the Department of Justice was strictly limited in what election-related actions it could take. It could not oversee states' actions in administering their elections, and it could not support litigation filed by President Trump's campaign. Nonetheless, President Trump continued to push DOJ to file this lawsuit over the following days and essentially act as an arm of his political campaign. Rosen's December 30th call with the president. Even after the December 29th meeting, President Trump and those working on his behalf still wanted DOJ leadership to file U.S. versus Pennsylvania on December 30th, Acting Attorney General Rosen had a phone call with President Trump that included a discussion about the lawsuit. During the call, Rosen clearly explained to the president that DOJ could not file the lawsuit. Rosen said, "This doesn't work. There's multiple problems with it, and the Department of Justice is not going to be able to do it." According to Rosen, Trump accepted what he said without argument. Yet Trump and his allies continued pressuring the department to file suit. December 31st meeting. On December 31st, 2020, President Trump suddenly returned to Washington, D.C. from Florida, where he had been celebrating Christmas. Shortly after Air Force One landed, Rosen and Donahue were summoned to the Oval Office once again. They met with the president that afternoon. President Trump was a little more agitated than he had been in the meeting on the 15th, according to Donahue. The president remained adamant that the election has been stolen, that he won, and that the American people were being harmed by fraud, and that he believed the Justice Department should be doing something about it. The president once again raised the prospect of naming Clark the acting attorney general. Donahue and Rosen repeated what they had told the president previously, that he should have the leaders that he wanted, but it's really not going to change anything. That he should have the leaders he wanted, but it wouldn't do anything. President Trump again asked why the DOJ would not file a complaint with the Supreme Court, alleging that the election was fraudulent. Rosen and Donahue explained once more that the DOJ did not have standing. DOJ represents the federal government, not the American people. President Trump was incredulous and became very animated. The president kept repeating the same questions. How is that possible? How can that possibly be? President Trump also floated the prospect of naming a special counsel, suggesting Ken Cuccinelli from the Department of Homeland Security as a possible candidate. This sounds like the kind of thing that would warrant appointment of a special counsel, Donahue recalled the president saying. The president did not order the DOJ to name a special counsel, but he was clearly still thinking about it. Donahue and Rosen didn't say a lot in response, but simply pointed out that there was no evidence to support the many individual allegations that had been made, so there was no evidence that would warrant appointing a special counsel. President Trump again raised the Antrim County, Michigan allegations. Hold on, I think my cat's hungry. Okay. During the December 31st meeting, the president also raised the prospect of seizing the voting machines. Why don't you guys seize the machines? He asked. Clearly. You guys should seize machines because there will be evidence, Donahue recalled President Trump saying. Rosen pushed back, saying the DOJ had no basis to seize the voting machines from the states. They needed a search warrant, but there was no evidence to justify one. Rosen explained to President Trump again that the DOJ has no responsibility for oversight as the states conduct the elections. Rosen added that to the extent that any federal agency is involved, it is the Department of Homeland Security which ensures software selection and quality control. At that point, the president called Ken Cuccinelli. Donahue recalled the president saying something along the lines of, Ken, the acting attorney general is telling me it's your job to seize the machines. Rosen had said nothing of the sort, but Cuccinelli quickly shut down the president's line of inquiry, making it clear that the DHS had no such authority. White House counsel Pat Cipollone was also in attendance and supported the DOJ leadership throughout the meeting. When Rosen spoke to Clark by phone on December 31st or January 1st, Clark revealed that he had spoken to the president again, despite previously promising Rosen and Donahue that he would inform them of any other contact he received from the White House. Clark told Rosen that President Trump had offered Clark the position of acting attorney general and asked him to respond by Monday, January 4th. Clark, however, said that he needed to do some due diligence related to the claims of election fraud before deciding whether he would accept the president's offer. On January 2nd, 2021, Rosen and Donahue confront Clark again. On Saturday, January 2nd, Rosen and Donahue attempted once again to persuade Clark to stand down. The two reiterated that Clark should stop meeting with the president. Donahue reprimanded Clark, emphasizing that he was the boss and that Clark's ongoing contacts with the president were a violation of DOJ's White House contact policy. Clark acknowledged that he had been briefed by the ODNI as he had requested, and that there was nothing in that briefing that would have supported his earlier suspicion about foreign involvement. Nevertheless, Clark still wanted to send his letter to Georgia and other contested states alleging voter fraud. During the conversation, Clark confirmed that President Trump had offered him the position of acting attorney general. Clark told Rosen that he would decline the offer if Rosen and Donahue signed his dishonest letter to officials in Georgia. Wow. The two refused once again, making it clear that there is no way we were going to sign that. Bing bong, what's up, Fafa? We're making our way through. We're about halfway through. This shit is long AF. Oh, well, I also could have just seen it. What are you talking about? Oh, wow. Yeah, it is. Significant delay. Rosen reiterated his decision in an email on the night of January 2nd, writing, "I confirmed again today that I am not prepared to sign such a letter." That same day, President Trump attempted to coerce Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger into manufacturing enough votes to steal the election in that state. That call is discussed in Chapter 2 of this report. Let's see, do I have that? Oh, I do, but Not there. It's going to be here. Yes. Okay. So I've been going through the notes I have. I don't know if you can see this, but lined up by date, what they are, who did them, brief description, so we can see the timeline of events. I think that's my first goal, is to get this timeline down of major events and court cases and things people said. Okay. January 3rd. Clark informs DOJ leadership that he will accept President Trump's offer for acting attorney general. Let's see, did he do that? Clark, acting attorney general. He ends up not doing it. Trump ends up not doing it. Let's see if that plays out here. Clark offered Rosen the position of his deputy. Rosen thought that Clark's offer was preposterous and nonsensical. Rosen told the select committee that there was no universe where I was going to do that to stay on and support someone else doing things that were not consistent with what I thought should be done. Donahue believed it was a done deal, and Clark would become the head of DOJ. But Pat Cipollone told Rosen that it was not a done deal and that we should fight this out at the White House. White House call logs from January 3rd show that President Trump and Clark spoke 4 times that day, starting at 6:59 a.m. The first 3 calls of the day, 2 in the morning and 1 in the early afternoon, showed that the president spoke with Mr. Jeffrey Clark. The final call between the two of them, from 4:19 to 4:22 p.m., however, shows that President Trump spoke to Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Clark, suggesting that Clark had, in fact, accepted the president's offer. Acting Attorney General Rosen told the select committee that he would have felt comfortable being replaced by either Donahue or Engel, but he did not want the DOJ to be put in a posture where it would be doing things that were not consistent with the truth, were not consistent with its own appropriate role, or were not consistent with the Constitution. As a result, Rosen took 4 immediate steps to try and prevent Clark's ascension to Attorney General. First, he called Meadows and asked him to set up a meeting for that evening with the president. Second, Donald Trump, Pat Cipollone, Steve Engel, Jeffrey Clark, Richard Donahue, Jeffrey Rosen, Eric Hirschman, and Pat Philbin. This was Clark here, who was going after the acting AG role that Trump offered him. Rosen had a plot to get him to not be the acting attorney general. Second, he spoke to Cipollone, who told Rosen that Clark's appointment was not inevitable and that he would also be at the meeting that evening to support Rosen and Donahue. Third, Rosen called Engel and asked him to come to DOJ headquarters so he could attend the White House meeting. Finally, Rosen asked Donahue and another senior department attorney named Patrick Hovakimian to convene a meeting for the rest of the department's leadership to describe the situation to them and hear how they would react to Clark's appointment. Hovakimian set up a conference call. Although some of the assistant attorney generals were not able to participate in the call, all of those who did agreed that they would resign if Rosen were removed from office. Pat Hovakimian, that's quite a name, drafted a resignation letter that read, quote, "This evening, after Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen, over the course of the last week, repeatedly refused the president's direct instructions to utilize the DOJ's law enforcement powers for improper ends, the president removed Jeff from the department. PADAG, Rich Donahue, something, Attorney General, and I resigned from the department effective immediately." Hovakimian never sent the letter because the threat of mass resignations dissuaded Trump from replacing Rosen. Regardless, the letter stated a plain truth. President Trump was trying to use the DOJ for his own improper ends. Donahue and Dovahkian? No, Hovakimian. Get the fucking Dragonborn up in here. January 3rd, 2021 official meeting. At Rosen's request, the White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows arranged a meeting with the president at 6:15 that evening. We should pause to reflect on the timing and purpose of the meeting. Congress was set to meet in a joint session in less than 72 hours. The states had already certified their electors. Former Vice President Biden was going to be certified as the winner of the 2020 presidential election. There was no material dispute over Biden's victory. Trump and his lawyers had not produced any evidence of significant fraud. Instead, they presented one nonsensical conspiracy theory after another. The DOJ and FBI were forced to debunk those claims, and they did. None of this stopped President Trump's effort to subvert DOJ. Quite the opposite. The president pushed forward with a plan to install Jeff Clark as the acting attorney general, apparently to attempt to interfere with the certification of the Electoral College vote on January 6th. It's for this reason Rosen requested an emergency meeting on January 3rd. Before heading to the Oval Office, Rosen and Donahue discussed the possible leadership change with Cipollone and Pat Philbin. They were completely opposed to it, Donahue explained. In fact, no one who attended the Oval Office meeting supported the leadership change, other than Jeffrey Clark. Donahue didn't initially join the meeting, but the president soon called him in. During the meeting, Clark attempted to defend the last-minute move to make him acting AG. Clark said he would conduct real investigations that would, in his view, uncover widespread fraud. Clark declared that this was the last opportunity to sort of set things straight with this defective election, and he had the intelligence, the will, and the desire to pursue these matters in the way that the president thought was most appropriate. Everyone else quickly disagreed. President Trump asked Donahue and Engel what they would do, and both confirmed they would resign. Donahue added that theirs would not be the only resignations. You should understand that your entire department leadership will resign, Donahue recalled saying. This included every assistant attorney general. Mr. President, these aren't bureaucratic leftovers from another administration, Donahue continued. You picked them. This is your leadership team. You sent every one of them to the Senate. You got them confirmed. Donahue argued that the president would look bad in the wake of these mass resignations. What is that going to say about you when we all walk out at the same time? Donahue recalled asking the president, what happens if, within 48 hours, we have hundreds of resignations from your Justice Department because of your actions? What does that say about your leadership? Steve Engel reinforced Donahue's point, saying that Clark would be leading a graveyard. White House counsel Pat Cipollone threatened to resign as well, describing Clark's letter as a murder-suicide pact. Cipollone warned that the letter would damage everyone who touches it, and no one should have anything to do with it. Some of the participants in the meeting argued that Clark was the wrong person for the job of Attorney General. Clark attempted to defend his credentials, arguing that he had been involved in complicated civil and environmental litigation. That's right, you're an environmental lawyer, Donahue fired back. How about you go back to your office, and we'll call you when there's an oil spill. The meeting lasted approximately 3 hours. Only towards the end of the contentious affair did President Trump decide to reverse his earlier decision to make Clark the acting AG, reverse his earlier decision to make Clark the acting assistant attorney general. Donahue recalled President Trump addressing Clark along the following lines. Quote, I appreciate your willingness to do it. I appreciate you being willing to suffer the abuse, but the reality is you're not going to get anything done. These guys are going to quit. Everyone else is going to resign. It's going to be a disaster. The bureaucracy will eat you alive. And no matter how you want to get things done in the next few weeks, you won't be able to get it done, and it's not going to be worth the breakage. Clark tried... Clark tried to change President Trump's mind, saying, history is calling, this is our opportunity, and we can get this done. But the president was clearly rattled by the threat of mass defections and reiterated that the change would not happen. President Trump then wondered what would happen to Clark and if Donahue was going to fire him. Donahue explained that only the president had that authority. That was the end of the matter. That was the end of the matter. And we all got up and walked out of the Oval Office, Donahue recalled. But for one DOJ employee, the matter was not entirely settled. During the January 3rd meeting in the Oval Office, President Trump complained bitterly about B.J. Pak, the U.S. Attorney for the North District of Georgia. Barr had tasked Pak with investigating the State Farm Arena video in early December 2020. Like the FBI and Georgia state officials, Pak concluded that nothing nefarious had occurred. President Trump was dissatisfied. No wonder nothing's been found in Atlanta, because the U.S. attorney there is a never-Trumper, Donahue recalled the president saying. Donahue objected, saying Pak had been doing his job, but the president insisted, pointing out that Pak criticized him years earlier. But the president insisted, pointing out that Pack criticized him years earlier. This guy is a never-Trumper, the president reiterated. Wait. Trump said Pack criticized him a year earlier. This is why he was a never-Trumper. He should never have been in my administration to begin with. How did this guy end up in my administration? The president threatened to fire Pack. When Donahue pointed out that Pack was already planning to resign the next day, Monday, President Trump insisted that it be Pack's last day on the job. Pack later confirmed to Donahue that he would be leaving the next day. President Trump asked if those in attendance at the Oval Office meeting knew Bobby Christine, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Georgia. Even though Pack had a first assistant, who was next in line for Pack's job upon his resignation, President Trump wanted Christine to take the role. Christine did take over for Pack, but he did not find any evidence of fraud either. It was Donahue's impression that Christine concluded that the election matters were handled appropriately. Later in the evening of January 3rd, President Trump called Donahue to pass along yet another conspiracy theory. The president had heard that an ICE agent outside of Atlanta was in custody of a truck filled with shredded ballots. Donahue explained that ICE agents are part of the Department of Homeland Security, so the matter would be under that department's purview. The president asked Donahue to inform Ken Cuccinelli. That story, like all the others, turned out to be a fiction when DOJ investigators evaluated the claim. The truck was carrying shredded ballots, but they were from a previous election. The old ballots had been shredded to make room for storing ballots from the 2020 election. Call from Trump to Donahue. So Trump push the Atlanta truck filled with shredded ballots conspiracy theory. President Trump's unprecedented attempt to subvert the DOJ. The most senior DOJ officials at the end of President Trump's term stopped him from co-opting America's leading law enforcement agency for his own corrupt purposes. Recall that Attorney General Barr commented, quote, "You can't live in a world where the incumbent administration stays in power based on its view, unsupported by specific evidence, that there was fraud in the election." Richard Donahue concluded that Jeffrey Clark's letter may very well have spiraled us into a constitutional crisis. Jeffrey Rosen summed up his short time as the acting Attorney General like this, quote, "During my tenure, we appointed no special prosecutors, we sent no letters to states or state legislators disputing the election outcome, we made no public statements saying the election was corrupt and should be overturned, we initiated no Supreme Court actions, nor filed or joined any lawsuits calling into question the legitimacy of our president of our election and institutions. President Trump attempted to get DOJ to do each of those things. Oh, that's part of the quote. And that's chapter 4. Chapter 5. A coup in search of a legal theory. On the morning of January 6th, 2021, Vice President Michael R. Pence gathered his staff to pray. Vice President Pence and his closest advisors knew that the day ahead would be a challenging one. They asked God for guidance and wisdom in the hours to come. No Republican had been more loyal to President Trump throughout his turbulent presidency than Vice President Pence. The vice president rarely, if ever, criticized his boss, but as January 6 approached, President Trump turned on his own vice president. President Trump was desperate. As described in the previous chapters, the president was searching for a way to stay in power. He had lost the election to former VP Biden. He had run out of legal options to overturn the election weeks earlier, when his lawyers lost nearly every court case they filed. That's a good quote. The president pursued other means as well. President Trump and his lawyers tried to convince state and local officials to overturn the election, but they met resistance. Those same officials would not break the law or violate the oath to the Constitution. President Trump and his associates tried to convince state legislatures to replace the legitimate electors won by former Vice President Biden with Trump electors. The Trump campaign each convened their own fake electors who submitted false electoral votes to Washington, but those efforts failed too. President Trump also attempted to use the DOJ for his own corrupt political purposes. President Trump offered the job of acting attorney general to a loyalist. He wanted this same DOJ official, Jeffrey Clark, to send a letter to several states suggesting that they should certify the fake electors convened by the Trump campaign. President Trump's effort to subvert the DOJ came to a head on January 3rd when the department's senior personnel and lawyers in the White House counsel's office threatened mass resignations if Clark was installed. This is a good summary. At that point, theories about a role the vice president could play at the joint session had been circulating in certain corners of the internet and among Trump's supporting attorneys. President Trump focused his attention on the man who had loyally served by his side for 4 years. On January 4th, President Trump summoned Vice President Pence to a meeting in the Oval Office with John Eastman, a law professor representing President Trump in litigation challenging the election result. Eastman argued on Trump's behalf that the vice president could take matters into his own hands during the joint session on January 6th. Eastman offered Vice President Pence two options. First, the vice president could unilaterally reject the certified electors from several states won by Biden, thereby handing the presidency to Trump, or, according to Eastman, Vice President Pence could delay the joint session to give state legislatures the opportunity to certify new electors loyal to the president. Eastman admitted in front of the president that both options violated the Electoral Count Act of 1877, the statute that sets forth the process for counting and disputing electoral votes during the joint session. Eastman admitted as much in a subsequent conversation with the vice president's staff as well. Ooh, that's handy. Oh. Therefore, President Trump knew, or should have known, that his scheme was illegal. In fact, it violated the Electoral Count Act and the U.S. Constitution. President Trump repeatedly demanded that Vice President Pence go through with it anyway. Vice President Pence rejected President Trump's demands many times on January 4th and in the days that followed. Vice President Pence correctly pointed out that he had no power to take any action other than counting the certified electoral votes. America's founders could not possibly have contemplated a scenario in which the VP could unilaterally reject electoral votes and decide the outcome of a presidential election. That is a massively dumb idea. Because if the vice president is part of your same political party, then that's just incentive for him to do that anyway, regardless of any controversy that may or may not exist. Like, how could that ever possibly be a valid legal theory? That's like saying it's valid legally to just say you're now the only law that applies just because you say so. President Trump used his bully pulpit at rallies and on Twitter to lie to his supporters. President Trump told them that Vice President Pence had the power to deliver another 4 years in the White House. It was not true. President Trump's campaign of coercion became so intense that Mark Short, Vice President Pence's chief of staff, alerted the head of the VP's Secret Service detail to the impending danger. On January 5th, Short warned that as the disagreements between Trump and Pence became more public, that the president would lash out in some way. This is all a very good summary. Indeed, President Trump did. And those around him recognized that his lashing out at the vice president could have disastrous consequences. On the morning of January 6th, an agent in the Secret Service's intelligence division was alerted to online chatter regarding the VP being a dead man walking if he doesn't do the right thing. Wow. Oh, online chatter. Yeah, we knew that. A few minutes later, another agent made a comment that turned out to be an ominous prediction. Quote, I saw several other alerts saying they will storm the Capitol if the vice president doesn't do the right thing. During his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th, President Trump repeatedly pointed his finger at Vice President Pence. President Trump insisted that if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. Trump added, and Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us, and if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country because you're sworn to uphold the Constitution. President Trump's scheme required Vice President Pence to break his oath to the Constitution, not uphold it. By the time the president spoke at the ellipse, he also knew that the VP had no intention of overturning the election. Trump then sent a mob to the U.S. Capitol. He did so even after being informed by the Secret Service that people in the crowd possessed weapons. He wanted his supporters to intimidate VP Pence and any other Republican who refused his demands. The president told the crowd assembled before him to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to our Republicans, the weak ones, at the U.S. Capitol to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. The mob overran the U.S. Capitol in short order. At 2:24 p.m., while the attack was well underway, Trump tweeted, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth." Again, the opposite was true. VP Pence showed courage on January 6th. The vice president refused to be intimidated by President Trump's mob, even as chants of, quote, "Hang Mike Pence" echoed throughout the halls of the U.S. Capitol, and a makeshift gallows was constructed on the Capitol grounds. I remember seeing that. You remember seeing that? Were you watching that day? We were all, I was glued to my phone. Several of us were. That was a wild day. It's no mystery why the mob turned on Vice President Pence. President Trump told his supporters that the election was stolen and that Vice President Pence had the power but lacked the courage to fix it. None of this was true. President Trump and the Vice President have both reflected on the events of January 6th in the months since then. Vice President Pence has described President Trump's demands as, quote, "un-American." Trump has since insisted that the VP could have overturned the election. Asked about the calls to hang the vice president, Trump said it was common sense. What? I didn't see that. In early 2022, U.S. District Judge David Carter evaluated the Trump-Eastman scheme to pressure the VP. Judge Carter described it as, quote, "a campaign to overturn a democratic election, an action unprecedented in American history. It was a coup in search of a legal theory," Judge Carter found, "that likely violated at least 2 federal laws. The Trump-Eastman scheme was not a feature of the U.S. Constitution, as Trump told his supporters. Instead, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transition of power, undermining American democracy and the Constitution. And it all began because the president refused to accept the results of the election, expressed through the votes of 81 million Americans." Okay, and I think that's a good place to stop tonight. 30, chapter 5. All right, Papa. Have a good night. I'll be back on tomorrow. Peace.